Hello, and welcome to the Questions and Answers edition of the Thriving Kids podcast from the Child Mind Institute. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Anderson. Last week, I spoke with Katie Painovic, a clinical social worker on our school and community programs team, about one of the hardest topics that many parents face: death, grief, and loss. We explored why it's not only okay, but important to talk about loss with kids and teens, how to validate big feelings, ways to show up for your child even when you're grieving or feeling big feelings as well, and what healing looks like over time. This week, I'll be taking on your follow-up questions submitted by our listeners about how to support kids through grief and loss. Let's get into it. Starting off this week with our first question. It's a bit of a complicated one because it's about the intersection of a kid who is neurodiverse and the subject of grief and loss. So one of our listeners asked, "My child is very angry about the death of a parent and also has ADHD and ODD." For those of our listeners who don't know what ODD means, it's oppositional defiant disorder, is that diagnosis. How do I support them when grief shows up as anger, oppositional behavior, or outbursts? So to answer this question, I'd like to quote from one of my favorite colleagues, Eliza Pressman. One of my favorite phrases that Eliza uses is, "All feelings are welcome, all behaviors are not." So one of the things we think about in grief and loss is that, for any kid, they may have all kinds of feelings. It may be sadness, it may be anger, and as you'll hear on the podcast with Katie, grief doesn't necessarily proceed in stages. Emotions aren't necessarily predictable. There's lots of different emotions that we can have in relation to this. And what this question gets to is the notion that if a child already has some sort of existing vulnerability or neurodiversity, their grief may express itself in that way. It may express itself through their behavior. It may express itself through outbursts. And so what we're thinking about with parents is we're trying to say, okay, how can we communicate to a kid who's experiencing these sorts of reactions that we want to make space for their feelings, in the sense that if they're experiencing these feelings and they want to talk about them with us, or they want to maybe engage in some sort of memorializing activity of the loss, or if they just want to do something distracting that moves them away from those really intense emotions and allows them to just kind of ride the wave for a little while, we're here for it. That's in a zone of validating feelings and tolerating any behaviors, because those behaviors are still quite welcome and contributing to the grieving process. Then there's a category of behaviors that may be understandable in light of the grief that a child is experiencing, but at the same time are not necessarily behaviors that we can say we want to make space for, because perhaps they involve lack of safety, perhaps they involve a really disproportionate reaction that impairs the child's functioning, either at home or at school. And so that's where we want to tell parents, part of dealing with a sensitive situation like this is that there are tried and true evidence-based models of dealing with behavior for kids with ADHD and ODD. Those are actually discussed in our podcast episode with Dr. Caroline Mendel, which is our first podcast episode ever about behavioral interventions, where we want to be thinking about what we're reinforcing and what we're giving perhaps consequences for, and saying, I understand your feelings, but at the same time I have to set a boundary here and say that this is not a way that I can have us cope with those feelings, even while I'm giving you all these other options for how we'd like to cope together. And that's really the balance, is trying to assess a situation as, is this a situation where I can make space for the child's emotional reaction, or is this a situation where I might need to utilize some of these behavioral interventions to bring what's going on back to a place where we can engage together in grieving, talking it out, riding the wave, or any other of, a slate of coping strategies that we're hoping to help a child kind of build into their repertoire. Our next question: is it okay to talk to my child about death directly, or could that make things worse? This is one of the most frequently asked questions about death and grief. And the easiest thing to remember is that kids do better when they're not in the dark. What we mean by that is we want to talk to kids directly about really tough topics at their developmental level. So for a younger child, it might just be, thinking about sitting down with them, informing them very bluntly that, someone has died. And when I say very bluntly, I don't mean like we're trying to shock the kid with it. I just mean more that we're just trying to phrase it as directly as possible. This person has died. I know that's a lot to handle, and I want you to know I'm here if you want to talk about it or you have questions. That's the entire speech for a younger kid. For an older teenager, it might be a little bit more complex in the sense that we want to let them know about the death. We know that they might have had, relationships to the person, and we're still kind of going along the same outline of letting them know about this as directly as possible, saying, especially to older kids, it can be really helpful for us to talk about our own reaction. I'm experiencing a lot of feelings. I know for me, one of the things I'm doing right now is X. I want you to know I want to make space for your feelings or however you're going to be kind of processing this news, and I want you to know that I'm here. Those are kind of the main talking points just for talking about death with anyone. A lot of parents will say, could it make things worse? Like, if I just don't talk about it, will they get over it more quickly or will it affect them less? And the answer is no. There's no evidence that not talking about something helps people to get past it. More often than not, it makes it so that when there's this kind of range of uncertainty or high emotionality, kids end up personalizing it. They say, I don't really understand what's going on, so I must be doing something wrong. Either I'm doing something wrong and that's what's causing my parent to be emotional, or I'm doing something wrong in the way that I'm coping with things. And given that that's occurring, we want kids to feel like they can have this open line of communication with parents to say, hey, I'm experiencing this. I don't really understand what's going on, or I have these questions. Can we take some space to talk about this? Our next question is, how do I tell my 5-year-old that someone has died? What should I say and what words should I avoid? And this is a great follow-up to the last question where, I'll say again, for younger kids, we're looking for 3 main talking points. We're just going to tell them that the person has died. We're then going to let them know that, any number of reactions or feelings are completely something that we might expect, and that we're here to talk about it. We're here if they have questions. We're here to help them think about how we can remember that person. That's basically the outline of it. And beyond that, some parents will say, well, I want to make sure to also couch this at some level within our family's, faith or our religious background. And we say that makes perfect sense. You might add to the first talking point as you're telling a kid that someone has died, a bit more about kind of your beliefs about what happens when someone dies, and perhaps within your faith, what sorts of things one does when someone passes. And that can be helpful because one of the things that we talk to parents about is that after you inform a kid about a death or a loss, and you let them know that their feelings are valid and that you're here as a space to discuss that or for them to ask questions, we talk about the fact that returning to certain routines or having certain routines that are part of your culture or faith basis in your family can be really comforting and centering in that you know that you can grieve together with your community, you can find that kind of social support, and you can also feel like this is a way of paying your respects and honoring the person who's been lost. So those routines, those rituals, those patterns that we engage in as human societies in grieving someone, those can be very centering and grounding for a kid in their grief process, even when they're young, even when they're 5 years old. They can understand it at a sort of rudimentary level. In terms of what words we should avoid, telling a child about a death is something that we want parents to feel like they can be open about, and it's not going to cause the child to have a larger emotional reaction. I think more often than not, when I get the question of what word should I avoid, it's feeling like as we watch a child experience a certain amount of pain, we as parents, we as caregivers, can feel a pressure to make it not as permanent, or maybe promise them that they will have contact with this person, or maybe kind of shy away from the level of permanence that grief, loss, and death come with. And I would say that as much as we possibly can, I would let that kind of sink in and let the child know we're there to process it with them. So if they say, wait a second, I'm never going to see grandma again, and we say, that's right, honey. You're never going to see grandma again, but we're going to remember grandma, in this way and in this way. I'm here to help you think about your feelings and answer any questions you have. And for those of you watching on video, you'll see that I'm tearing up as I say this because I'm thinking about the conversations I've had and that my wife has had with our 9-year-old and our 6-year-old after people who are close to us or close family members have passed, or when we're processing losses. So our next question is, my child seemed fine at first, but now big waves of sadness hit out of nowhere. Is that normal, and how should I respond when it comes and goes? This is one of the main slides that we as Child Mind Institute clinicians present in any talk on grief and loss, and that is that there is not a normal way that grief necessarily happens. Grief happens in fits and starts. It can happen continuously. It can be ups and downs. We want to make sure that people aren't putting a kind of like level of analysis on their grief where they're saying, I don't understand, I should be feeling more sad, or I shouldn't be feeling like this, or it shouldn't hit me out of nowhere. Grief is a process. It's an unpredictable process. It can look very different from individual to individual. And importantly, we don't use language like getting over it with grief. What we'll often think about is trying to think about how we can use language that suggests integration, that grief and loss is just something you carry with you, and it gets kind of interwoven with who you are, not something that like you move beyond or compartmentalize or put away. In that context, the notion that emotion is unpredictable, that waves of sadness can hit you out of nowhere, is completely understandable. And so if we see a kid who at first seems fine, they might be in shock, they might not be processing it, they might also be processing it okay. Kids can seem fine in the wake of a loss, and that doesn't mean anything is going wrong. And then when we see that a kid is experiencing these kinds of big waves of sadness, all we want parents and caregivers to be thinking is grief has no necessarily predictable, timeline. It's okay for these feelings to be occurring. How can I make space to say to a kid, I see that you're feeling these feelings. I want you to know I'm here as a supportive presence. I want you to know I'm here if you want to talk about it, or if you have questions, or if you just want to figure out, the way that you can ride a wave by taking a walk, listening to music, us thinking about, something that we can do that is involving that person's favorite activity or something that we feel like pays tribute to them. Any of those things are good processes of grieving. Importantly, you're going to see two questions from now that there can be processes of grieving when we do worry about kids, and I'm going to get into what that looks like. Our next question. I'm trying to hold it together, but my child keeps seeing me cry. How do I support them when I'm also having a hard time? This is another fantastic question from our listener community here on the Thriving Kids podcast, because for all manner of life events, we get questions from parents where they say, should I show my emotions to my kid about this? And our answer is absolutely, because modeling is a key aspect of how we help kids develop coping skills, how we help them develop their own emotion regulation, how we help them to develop their own resilience and grit. They need to see how we process challenging situations and that we face really big emotional challenges. So if your child sees you cry, what I'll often say to a parent is that that's instructive to them. It's saying, here's how someone processes grief. Here's how we're making space for a validation of any emotions you might be feeling. And we want parents to explicitly label that. The reason for that is that while teenagers can often understand, because they can kind of see the entire chessboard, that maybe a loss or something that you're grieving has occurred, and they can say, okay, that's not me. Little kids in particular, if they see you cry, their thinking is, what's happened? Is it something that relates to me? Is it something that's going to affect my life? Have I done something wrong? And so often we hear parents and caregivers say, no, my child knows that it's nothing that they did. And then when we talk to the child says, is it something that I did? And we want to make sure that we're explicit about what happened. Kids do better when they're not in the dark. We want to make sure it's explicit about how we're processing it and modeling for our child that sometimes we experience really big feelings and, we might be crying or we might be feeling that sense of sadness. And then beyond that, what we're hoping to do, particularly with little kids, is to say, look, I want you to know this is how I'm processing my emotions for this. And then what we pivot to is how we're making sure still to provide for their needs or keeping them safe or supporting them. And the notion that we can, chew gum and walk at the same time. We want kids to know that even as we're sad and even as we're crying, we're going to make sure that, they get dinner. We're going to make sure that we get them to school. We're going to make sure that they might have a play date with a friend. We can be sad and at the same time still be moving through the routines of life. And if they're feeling really sad, we can support them. We want them to know that it won't make our sadness worse. All of those things are wonderful things to communicate to a kid in the midst of a grieving process for a family. Now getting to the question of when we worry. One of our listeners asked, when should I worry that my child's grief is becoming something more serious? What sign suggests it's time to get additional support? When we talk to parents about any moment where they might want to speak to someone or speak to a therapist, speak to a mental health professional about their child, there's kind of two lines to this question. One is that we wish that our society functioned such that stigma was so low and mental health care was so available that parents really felt like they could go to a counselor or a mental health professional or a social worker or a psychologist just for consultation throughout the process of parenting. That's the ideal. That's something that I and my colleagues dream about for the future, where it's not so much that you have to wait until you're worrying about your child, but that we as a society understand that mental health, youth mental health, psychology as a science has things that we can offer as layers of prevention in school settings, in community settings, to parents and caregivers that are about building up coping skills, building up emotion regulation, building up resilience, building up wellness and thriving and skills that help us to kind of even go not from the place of just eliminating suffering, but a place of really investing in our lives together. Mental health as a field has a lot to offer parents just from that kind of preventative stance. Then we get to the fact that because stigma is still high and mental health care availability is still fairly low, and parents still feel like maybe the reason why they would consult a mental health professional oftentimes is only if they are worrying about their kid. That's where we want to give them the guidelines that we use as a field. And I've referenced this in other Q&A episodes, but it's abbreviated by the acronym FIDI. It's that, when we look at diagnostic criteria for any mental health diagnosis, mental health learning disorder for children or adolescents, we ask parents about frequency, intensity, duration, and impairment. Kids can be sad. Kids can be irritable. Kids can experience really difficult childhood events or things that we might consider to be very disorganizing or big losses, things like that. Kids can be unfocused from time to time or distractible. Kids can feel anxious. All of those things fit into some of the typical challenges that kids might encounter. What we're asking parents is, how often does it happen? How long has it been happening? How intense is it when it happens? And does it make it so a child has a lot of difficulty, maybe functioning at the level that we might expect for that kid's kind of profile of strengths and weaknesses, or strengths and we should say growth areas, not necessarily weaknesses, within a school environment or with their friends or with their family. And so as we ask those questions, I would like parents not to think that they have to get to a place where it's dire and serious before they talk to somebody. But in general, with something like the process of grief, I think that we would say that over the course of the first couple weeks after a loss, a lot of big feelings are incredibly typical. It can be hard to kind of get back into routines, but some of the things that we look out for in a child's grief process, do they seem like they're having a lot of what we would call intrusive thoughts about this loss? They can't stop thinking about the loss of this person or the death. They say that their feelings are not decreasing in intensity over the course of a matter of weeks. They're having difficulties with sleeping or kind of other daily routines. They're reporting nightmares. They're seeming to be extremely anxious about the loss of other attachment figures. Those are some of the things that we look out for where we would say, please, if you can, speak to a supportive figure in your community, a school counselor, a mental health professional about the process that your child is going through and how maybe some additional support can help that child to understand their grieving process and maybe get some support to help things to go to a level of intensity that's a little bit easier to cope with, or to help the child kind of integrate this loss or perhaps process it a bit more than they might be doing in the typical rhythm of daily life. So our last question is very much a kind of unique one for this particular Q&A episode, but we really loved it when we saw this submitted because it gets to some of the processes of grief and loss that maybe we don't think about sometimes because we're so centered on the idea of like what we should be doing as a parent or a caregiver. So this question is, what role can imaginary friends play in helping a child process grief? So to kind of put some context behind this question, younger children have a lot of imaginary processes that are a part of how they process their emotional experience. Some kids might have imaginary friends, some kids might have stuffed animals, some kids might be rehearsing conversations in their head, some kids might have action figures. There can be any number of, imaginary toys, narratives, things that kids play out that give us to some degree a window into how they might be processing their experiences. It's not necessarily linear. We caution parents to kind of overinterpret certain ways that younger kids play because, maybe the parent is offended at what the parent character is doing in this and says, oh my gosh, is this representing me? Or maybe they're worried because the child is throwing out kind of some themes that they didn't think were necessarily something they'd been exposed to or something that that child is aware of. All of this is to say, these are typical outgrowths of the way that younger children process their experiences. So what we're looking at is whatever these imaginary friends might be, or stuffed animals, or narratives they're playing out, first, we're interested, we're curious. If a kid came into the office and says, I'm talking with my imaginary friend Joe about this, I just want to go from a place of curiosity. I want to say, all right, talk to me about Joe. What's Joe like? What kinds of conversations are you having? What's going on? How can I add to the dynamic that's going on with your friend Joe? And that's the kind of pivot, is that what I'm looking for is, how can I be curious? How can I be validating of the fact that this is a young child who perhaps is processing grief in a way that is, thinking through this in a realm of kind of imagination and fantasy? And then at the same time, how can I be sure that that child is also engaging in the real world? That they're bringing me in on the conversation with Joe. It's not just, being pushed into that place of an imaginary friend narrative where they might not be leaning on some of the very real world supports that they have. So I'm probably pivoting in a discussion with a kid back to, and what are you talking about with your parent? And what are you doing with your parent or in real life to memorialize this person? How are you remembering them? What are you sharing with your parent? What can you share with me? And in that sense, I want to build it out as completely typical that a kid could have a more fantasy process in thinking through these experiences. And at the same time, I want a child to know that we also want to make available all of these real-world options for processing this loss. So, with that, and with the kind of divide between the fantasy and reality, I just want to say to all of you, thank you for listening. I know this is an incredibly challenging topic. For many of you, this can be triggering. It can be difficult to think about. If you were listening to this on a drive or a walk or while washing the dishes and you found yourself, with tears welling up in your eyes or feeling some level of sadness or wondering if, there's something that you might do to memorialize someone you haven't thought about in a while, all feelings are welcome. All of those processes of processing grief are welcome. And I hope that you'll take the time to think about what you can do for yourself and those around you in relation to these sorts of processes. Thanks for listening. As you heard during our Thriving Kids podcast episode this week, we want to send out a huge thanks to all of our listeners for submitting questions about grief and loss and allowing us to engage with you in such an insightful kind of series of questions about how kids from young ages up to teens process grief and loss and how we as caregivers can support them. You can find related resources and articles in our show notes and at childmind.org. Next week, we're shifting gears and talking all about children and sleep with Dr. Shelby Harris. We'd love to feature your questions in a future Q&A episode. Please feel free to comment on our social posts or email us at podcast@childmind.org. I'm Dr. Dave Anderson. Thanks so much for listening to Thriving Kids, and we'll see you next time.